Our topic for today is the Cold War at home. We'll be looking at the ways in which life in the United States was impacted by the threat of the Cold War, the anxiety and the fear that came along with this worldwide competition with the Soviet Union. The picture here right on the first slide is an example of sort of sums up that anxiety, right? The Red Menace, report suspected communist activity, right? Citizens in the U.S. were reminded that there was a threat and that, anyone could be a communist, right? They look like you and me, be suspicious, kind of keep an eye out on each other, very big brother sort of anxiety and suspicion. So in the notes here and also in the book, we'll be looking at the ways in which this anxiety was very real for people living in the United States during this time period. So let's start off by getting to the question of, well, why was there fear, right? Like, okay, there's communists in the United States, like, so what? Why should we be afraid if there are communist spies or traitors who might want to turn the U.S. into a communist country? Like, why should we be afraid of that? Well, a couple reasons. One of them had to do with the fact that people remembered back to World War II when Hitler had used to great effect spies and traitors inside of other countries to help him take over, to help spread Nazi Germany. And so folks remembered that and were a little bit leery, didn't want to see that same thing happen with communism. Closely related to that was the fact that during the Great Depression, membership in the American Communist Party had increased significantly. And that makes sense if you think about what was going on during the Great Depression. Some folks lost everything, right? Tough to get a job. Economic situation was very, very difficult for many, many Americans. And so it would make sense that people might think, well, communism might be a solution, might be a way to get out of this economic trouble. A third reason that there was fear of communist spies and traitors was the fact that you had some very prominent American leaders telling the public that there were communist spies and traitors and that we should be concerned about it. And we'll talk about one of the most infamous of those American leaders in just a minute. But you can imagine, right, if you've got some of the members of Congress and other high-ranking positions going out and telling people that there is this threat, you might be inclined to believe them. One of the most prominent examples of this was the House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC. And this was a committee in the House of Representatives that subpoenaed witnesses. They called witnesses in front of the committee in Washington to investigate communist influence in America, particularly in Hollywood and in labor unions. Here is a picture of someone testifying in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and it gives you a sense of just how high profile this was and how very public it was. You can just see the committee room is jam-packed. You have reporters in the front. You have spectators and members of the gallery watching these very high-profile committee hearings. And it made people very concerned that labor unions and the film industry were infiltrated with communists who were going to try to spread communist messages throughout America. Adding to this were a couple really, really public legal trials about spying. One of them involved a government official in the State Department named Alger Hiss. And this involved Alger Hiss passing secrets to the Soviets. Think about that. A high-ranking State Department official, somebody working for the United States government who has access to very important information, was convicted of spying for the Soviets. That might make you worry. That might scare you a bit to think that someone that important would be spying for the Soviets. A second very high-profile case was the Rosenberg trial. And this involved the husband and wife, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were convicted of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, helping the Soviets to get atomic weapons, to develop more advanced atomic weapons. And just like with the Alger Hiss case, right, that would probably scare you. That people, Americans inside of the U.S., would be working against the United States, working to help the Soviets, even to help the Soviets develop atomic weapons. And so here are the Rosenbergs, husband and wife, Julius and Ethel. They were convicted of espionage and were actually both later executed. Another important figure that spread this paranoia and perhaps maybe even best exemplifies the paranoia against communism during this time period is this guy, Joseph McCarthy, a senator from the state of Wisconsin. McCarthy has in a lot of ways become synonymous with communist witch hunts. McCarthy was in charge of a Senate committee, so he's not on the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. He's in the Senate, and his committee was investigating communist influence within the government. And he was known for accusing people without having evidence to back it up, right? McCarthyism. And he accused a lot of people, and eventually he went too far. He accused members of the U.S. Army, including some high-ranking officials in the Army, of being communists and being influenced by communism. And once that got so extreme, and people saw just kind of how big of a bully he was, there was a lot of backlash. People were very shocked and it felt he'd gone way too far. And he eventually was censured or reprimanded by the U.S. Senate and sort of faded out of the spotlight. But all of these different areas, McCarthy, the Rosenberg trials, and the idea of spies and traitors inside the United States, all helped to create a very tense, very anxious atmosphere in the United States during this time period.